According to the calendar, the first day of spring is about March 21st. But here in the living waters of Elk Island, spring is not really noticeable until around the middle of April, when the ice melts. Smaller ponds become free of ice first. Since small ponds contain less water than lakes, less energy is needed to melt the ice and heat the water. As the ice melts back towards the center, water begins to appear along the shores. As the ice gets thinner, it cracks and splits apart. The sun creates holes in the ice, and it begins to look like a giant dark honeycomb as water seeps in. When ice is watery like this, strong warm winds blowing across the ponds can break up the ice and leave the ponds ice-free in a single day. Spring winds are important to life in the ponds. They help replenish the oxygen and nutrients that were used up by pond life during the winter. The winds act like giant blenders, swirling and churning the water around, mixing oxygen from the air into the water. The surface layers of water become warmer and sink below the lower layers. Since the pond layers are overturned, this process is called spring overturn. In this process, oxygen, a substance needed by almost all living things, is mixed throughout the pond. Nutrients are stirred up from the pond bottom by the wind and wave action. Nutrients are food substances that plants and animals need in order to grow properly. The supply of nutrients is also replenished by spring runoff. The ponds and lakes of Elk Island are surrounded by low-lying hills called knobs. As the sun shines on the knobs, the snow melts and the water runs off the knobs into the kettles. Nutrients contained in the runoff are carried into the ponds, where they are mixed by wind and waves throughout the water. Now that the ice is gone, sunlight can pierce the water. Because the water is shallow, sunlight filters right through to the pond bottom. The sun shining on the pond heats the water. As the pond heats up, a rush of activity begins. Many of the animals that live in the pond are cold-blooded. The body temperature of cold-blooded animals is about the same as the environment in which they live. This means that as the water temperature rises, the body temperatures of cold-blooded animals increase. This temperature increase allows the eggs deposited in and around the pond last year to begin to hatch. If you look carefully in the water, you might find mosquito larvae, mayfly larvae, or cranefly larvae. Mosquitoes take about 2 weeks to develop from the egg stage to an adult. Once they mature, they will mate and die. Adults only live about 4 weeks. A single mosquito can lay 50 to 80 eggs. Only the egg-laying female requires a blood meal. Sometimes the cases of caddisfly larvae can be found in the mud. If you look carefully, the larvae may still be in its home. These insects make protective cases out of materials like the sand and tiny twigs they find around them. Here and there, along the bottom, are tiny impressions scooped out of the mud. These tiny hollows lined with plants are the nests of stickleback. They are made by the male, who guards the eggs, and later the young. The hibernating frogs are wakened by the warm temperatures and return to the marshy shorelines. They will mate early in the spring and lay their eggs by mid-May. Throughout spring and summer, tadpoles in all stages of development can be seen. They first sprout hind legs, then forelegs, then their gills disappear, and they start to live on both land and water. Plants on the pond bottom also grow quickly in the warm, nutrient-rich waters. Although the leaves of perennials, such as bladderwort, die each autumn, the roots remain alive and begin to grow again in the spring. Bladderwort have tiny bladders or sacs on their stems. When a small animal brushes against the sac, it opens, and the animal is trapped and devoured by the plant. Annuals, plants that only live for 1 year, are found throughout the pond. Algae develop from seed-like spores that the adult plants deposited in the water before they died last autumn. As spring progresses, the pond surface becomes coated with a green, slippery scum. The scum is actually made up of long filaments, or strings, of tiny plants. Algae grow quickly in the warm, sunlit upper layers. Algae look much different under a microscope. Some look long and ribbon-like, with a spiral running through their centers. This is one of the types that form filaments on top of the water. Others are round, or have tails, or a box-like structure. Many of these plants reproduce by simply splitting in two. They grow and reproduce so quickly that the water turns cloudy. With the arrival of spring and the rapid growth of algae, tiny animals that feed upon algae hatch from their egg cases. This tiny animal is a Daphnia. You may see Daphnia hopping about in the pond water. Daphnia are also called water fleas. You may also find fairy shrimp or a hydra. Like an octopus, the hydra has long tentacles, which it uses to catch its prey. However, most of these tiny animals are too small to be seen without a microscope. Many of these tiny animals are food for a variety of insects. Dragonfly eggs can be found in reeds below the water. When the eggs hatch into a naiad, the second stage of development, the naiad remains underneath the surface for 3 months to 5 years. Dragonfly naiads are excellent hunters and can even catch and feed upon small fish. The outer skin of the naiad is like a suit of armor. In order to grow, the naiad must get rid of this old skin. This process of shedding is called molting. A naiad will molt several times before it becomes an adult. When the naiad is ready for the final molt, it climbs up a reed out of the water. The skin splits along its back, and the wings appear. The wings are limp and colorless at first, but then begin to stiffen, and an adult dragonfly is soon swooping about the pond. This insect floats on its back and uses its hairy hind legs like oars. It is called a back swimmer. Whirligig beetles circle about the pond, trapping bubbles of air in their wings as they dive. Their 2 sets of eyes allow them to see both above and below the surface at the same time. Oil glands, which make the water strider's feet water resistant, allow it to skate along the surface. The ponds of Elk Island and the surrounding region are often referred to as the duck factory of the prairies. More ducks are produced here each year than anywhere else in North America. They are attracted to the rich supply of food, insects, algae, and other tiny plants and animals. Many of these ducks migrate thousands of kilometers from the south. Some arrive even before the water is ice-free. At Elk Island, there is shelter for nesting along the shorelines and surrounding bush. Coots make their home in the beds of rushes and cattails. Mallards push farther into the woods. Some species, like the bufflehead, build their nest in old tree cavities. Red-necked grebes build a floating island of water plants, safe from non-swimming predators. Soon after the ice melts, the ducks mate, lay eggs, and soon young ducks begin to appear. They trail their mother closely as they continue to eat what seems to be an endless meal of tiny pond animals, seeds, and floating plants. Many species of birds also build nests in the shoreline vegetation. High in the cattails, red-winged blackbirds are found. Here there are lots of insects to eat, and they are hidden from predators. The sandhill crane, another migratory bird, makes only a short stop here before flying on to northern Canada to nest. Muskrats also live among the cattails and bulrushes along the shore. They construct homes from the cattails and bulrushes and plaster them with mud and pond weeds. In the spring, if the banks around the pond are firm, the muskrats will dig dens in which to have their young. Soon the babies will be following the parents around the pond. The beaver family in spring consists of 2 adults, last year's young, and this year's kits. The kits are born a month or 2 before the ice melts from the pond. As soon as the ice is gone, last year's young are sent out to live on their own. In spring, beaver repair their lodges and construct and repair dams. The dams trap water, forming ponds. The high water level protects the beavers from most non-swimming predators. The beaver lodge is built of mud and sticks and has an underwater entrance which keeps most predators out. Inside, there is a dry platform above the water level. Unless winter has been mild, spring is a short season, lasting only the months of May and June. It can sometimes snow in spring, but warm weather usually returns in a few days. Late spring snowstorms are beneficial to pond life because they create additional runoff, which carries more nutrients into the ponds. Although spring is a short season, it is a good time for field trips to Elk Island National Park. As you explore the lakes and ponds, watch, listen, and smell for signs of spring. Some of the pond life may be hidden or too small to see, but you can still find evidence of activity. Green, cloudy water suggests that the pond is rich in nutrients. A variety of insects tells you that the pond habitat is productive. You will see and hear many different kinds of birds. Clues to pond life are everywhere if you use all of your senses. These are the sights, sounds, and smells of spring in the living waters of Elk Island National Park. It's summer in the living waters of Elk Island National Park. If you visit Elk Island in summer, you will see the plant and animal life at its peak. You will discover firsthand what an ecosystem is and how it works. An ecosystem is a group of plants and animals living together in a particular environment. An ecosystem has 2 parts. One part is made up of living things like plants and animals. The other part is made up of non-living things like sunlight. The 2 parts of an ecosystem are interrelated. For example, non-living things like temperature, air, and water determine which plants and animals can live in a certain place. the availability of nutrients is also a factor. Nutrients are food substances that living things need for proper growth. They often are chemicals that a plant or animal cannot make by itself. Nitrogen and phosphorus are examples of nutrients. They are abbreviated by the symbols N and P. Plants absorb nutrients from the water and the mud. Animals obtain the nutrients they need by eating plants or other animals. All plants and animals need nutrients. Without them, no new growth can take place. The living aspect of an ecosystem is made up of three parts: decomposers, producers, and consumers. Decomposers are organisms that live on the remains of plants and animals. Snails are decomposers. They help to break down or decompose dead bodies. In this process, they release nutrients back into the pond, where they can be used again by other plants and animals. We can see some decomposers, like snails, but other decomposers, like bacteria, are microscopic. Bacteria break down the dead plants and animals even more than other decomposers. They make the mud and ooze at the pond bottom rich with nutrients. Producers are also part of the ecosystem. Producers are those plants that produce or make their own food. Not all plants can do this. Mushrooms, for example, can't make food. The only plants that can produce their own food are those containing a special green substance called chlorophyll. When chlorophyll and sunlight are present, green plants change carbon dioxide and water into food. Green plants use up carbon dioxide and give off oxygen in this process. All green plants can make their own food, from trees to pond lilies to microscopic algae. Animals are the third and last part of the living aspect of an ecosystem. They are called consumers because they consume or eat other living things. Some consumers eat plants. They are called herbivores. Other consumers eat other animals. They are called carnivores. Both the living and the non-living aspects of an ecosystem are interrelated. Each part of the ecosystem affects every other part. How do all of these parts work together? Let's take a closer look at the pond and find out. The most common plants in the pond are tiny water organisms called algae. Algae provide food for many animals, including side swimmers, tadpoles, and daphnia. Algae are producers because they can make their own food, and they produce oxygen, which is used by all animals. During the long, warm days of summer, many types of algae grow. Algae sometimes grow so quickly that the pond water turns green and cloudy. It looks almost like pea soup. This is called an algal bloom. The term algal bloom is a bit misleading. As you can see, the algae don't really produce any blooms or flowers. The term just describes a large, fast growth of algae. It means that a population explosion has occurred. Algae can bloom many times throughout the summer. Each time a new species of algae reaches its peak, a new bloom occurs. When a population of algae explodes like this, certain nutrients, like phosphorus, become locked up in the huge living mass of the algal bloom. Since the nutrients are locked up inside the bloom, other plants can't use them. This means that no new algae can grow. The algae die and the bloom disappears. Since this happens quickly, it is called a population crash. What happens to the algae that die? They fall to the bottom of the pond in a steady rain. There they are attacked by decomposers. The decomposers break down the mass of algae. Remember that some decomposers, like bacteria, are too small for us to see without a microscope. You can tell that bacteria are present in the pond, though. They give off a funny smell, something like rotten eggs. This smell is a byproduct of decomposition. It tells us that bacteria are at work. There is so much dead algae for the decomposers to feed upon that another population explosion occurs. This time, it is the bacteria that multiply rapidly. Bacteria do not eat just dead algae. They also consume dead pondweed, insects, and snails. As they decompose the dead matter, the bacteria use up oxygen and give off carbon dioxide. Before long, there is little oxygen left at the bottom of the pond. If the oxygen level drops too low, summer kill may occur. Large numbers of animals will die because there is not enough oxygen in the water. Oxygen is put back into the pond water in two ways. As bacteria decompose the dead matter, they release nutrients back into the water. These nutrients help new algae to grow. As algae grow, they release oxygen back into the water. Summer breezes also add oxygen to the pond. Waves stir up the surface and mix oxygen from the air into the lower layers of the water. Remember that the living and non-living parts of an ecosystem are interrelated. As populations of algae explode and crash in the nutrient-rich waters, populations of microscopic animals that feed upon them also peak and crash. Like links in a chain, the consumers, the animals, are connected to the producers, the algae. When living things, such as animals, are linked to other living things, like algae, because one eats the other, the relationship is described as a food chain. A food chain can have more than one link. Aquatic insects, snails, and side swimmers are linked to both algae and microscopic animals because they consume both the algae and these tiny animals. The insects, snails, and side swimmers are in turn linked to larger animals, such as fish and waterfowl, because the fish and waterfowl consume the insects, snails, and side swimmers. There are hundreds of different links or food chains in the pond, because each animal does not consume only one thing. Many interrelated food chains together form a food web. Invisible threads, like strands on a huge spider web, join all living things together. In the pond, we find algae and other pond plants at the center of the food web because they are producers. They make food. All of the consumers depend on producers like algae because none of the consumers can make their own food. Animals that consume algae, such as Daphnia, are called first-order consumers. Farther out from these first-order consumers are second-order consumers. Second-order consumers are animals like fish that eat first-order consumers like Daphnia. The strands of the food web are composed of third and even fourth-order consumers, such as water birds. Summer is a time of plenty at Elk Island National Park. If you visit the park in summer, you will discover an ecosystem spilling over with activity. And all parts of the ecosystem are interrelated, like the threads of a spider's web. In summer, these are truly the living waters. Autumn has come to Elk Island National Park. The brilliant fall colors show us that summer has ended. Although no new growth occurs in autumn, it is still a period of intense activity. Plants and animals must prepare for major changes in their environment. By autumn, there is little oxygen left at the bottom of the pond. Decomposers like bacteria use it up as they decompose or break down dead plants and animals. Animals also use up oxygen as they scuttle about. Oxygen is mixed into the pond during autumn by a process called fall overturn. This is what happens. During summer, the water at the surface of the pond is warmer than the water at the bottom of the pond. When autumn comes and the temperature gets colder, the surface layers are cooled. As they cool, the surface layers become heavy and sink below the warmer, lower layers. The pond layers are overturned or mixed from top to bottom. This is why the process is called fall overturn. This process of settling and mixing occurs over and over again, until all the water is the same temperature. Fall overturn is only one way in which oxygen is put back into the pond. Winds also play a role. They mix and churn the water at the pond's surface, mixing oxygen from the air into the water. Increased oxygen at the pond bottom will allow decomposition to occur throughout autumn and winter. It will also help pond life to survive. Once winter comes and the ice locks the pond shut, no more oxygen will enter the water. Cooling water temperatures and availability of oxygen are only one part of the changing autumn environment. The hours of sunlight also change. Green plants need sunlight in order to grow. When sunlight and a special green substance called chlorophyll are present, plants change water and carbon dioxide into food. As the hours of sunlight decrease, green plants, like algae, are no longer able to manufacture food, and so they die. The pond water slowly clears as the algae die and settle to the bottom. Algae are annuals. This means that they only live for 1 year. But before they die, algae leave behind seed-like spores. These spores lie dormant or inactive at the pond bottom throughout autumn and winter. They will begin to grow again in the spring. Not all the plants in the pond are annuals. Some plants, like cattails, are perennials. They live for more than 1 year. Like annuals, perennials make food when sunlight is available. When there is no longer enough light for food making to occur, perennial plants, like cattails, drop their leaves. But this does not mean that they die. Each year, cattails survive by storing food in underground stems. Cattails will begin to grow again in the spring. The decreasing hours of sunlight and death of green plants also affect the animal life. When the algae die, animals that depend on them as a major food source also die. Before they die, these tiny animals deposit egg capsules in the pond mud. The eggs will remain dormant throughout autumn and winter and will hatch in the spring. Do any animals survive in the pond during autumn? Animals that have a major food source other than green plants survive, but even these animals are affected by the decreasing sunlight and cooler temperatures. Insects like these diving beetles are cold-blooded. The temperature of cold-blooded animals is about the same as the environment in which they live. This means that as the water temperature becomes colder in autumn, the body temperature of cold-blooded animals drops. Their body functions slow down, and because animals like diving beetles or water striders are less active, they need less food to survive. By becoming less active, cold-blooded animals are able to live in the pond during autumn. There is another way in which cold-blooded animals survive the cold. They hibernate. Frogs burrow into the mud on the pond bottom, where they lie dormant until spring. There they obtain oxygen by absorbing it from the water through their skins. The frogs will not eat or breathe air again until spring. They are not affected by the cold because they are under the pond water, and the water never falls below freezing. Warm-blooded animals can keep a constant body temperature. During autumn, muskrats build homes of cattails, reeds, and mud near the shore and close to deep water. This home is well insulated and will help keep the muskrats warm by conserving body heat. Like the muskrat, beaver also remain active throughout the winter. Since beaver swim under the ice to their food cache, they need deep water in the ponds. If the water were shallow, it would freeze down to the pond bottom. This would force the beaver to search for food above the ice. There they would be easy prey for predators, such as coyotes. Autumn is a time when beaver make sure their dams are in good condition. The dams will keep a high water level in the pond throughout winter. Autumn is also a time when beaver pack their lodge with extra mud and sticks. Like the muskrat house, the beaver lodge helps to keep the animals warm by conserving their body heat and energy. The beaver lodge is like a fortress. It protects the beaver from predators. Autumn is one of the busiest seasons for beaver. In addition to repairing their lodge, the beaver build their food cache. The food cache is a thick network of tree branches placed in deep water. It reaches from the pond surface right down to the pond bottom. Throughout winter, beaver will bring back branches from the food cache. They then return to the warmth and dryness of the lodge before stripping off the nutritious bark. With their underwater food supply and insulated lodge, beaver will be protected from winter cold as well as winter predators. Autumn is a time of migration for much of the bird life of Elk Island National Park. Waterfowl must migrate each autumn. Food is in short supply, and once the lakes freeze over, there will be little protection from predators like weasels and coyotes. In autumn, the ponds are active feeding sites for water birds traveling south or to coastal areas. They are also a staging area for birds that nested further to the north. Each day, more geese, loons, grebes, sandhill cranes, and swans stop to rest and feed before continuing on. Autumn is a short season in the living waters. As the temperature dips to freezing, ice crystals appear in the quiet shallows along the shoreline. Small ponds freeze over first. But by early November, even the large lakes are covered by a sheet of ice. Mallards are often the last to leave, often waiting until the lakes are frozen. They search the nearby fields for seeds and grain long after the geese and swans have left. But finally they too feel winter's bite and desert the park. Then silence drifts over the ponds and lakes. Below the ice, the living waters wait for winter. It is winter. The living waters of Elk Island National Park seem to be sleeping. The ponds and lakes lie buried beneath a thick layer of ice and snow. But are the ponds really asleep? Is there life below the frozen waters? What would we discover if we dug down through the snow and ice? Let's find out. The floating ice layer, covered with snow, is like a blanket over the pond. It often makes the water below the ice warmer than the air above the ice. Even on the coldest days, water in the ponds never becomes cold enough to freeze. Perhaps there are some living things down there. In winter, the world below the snow-covered ice is quiet and dark. Snow prevents light from shining through the ice into the water. In the dark water at the bottom of the pond, perennial plants are found. Perennials are plants that live for more than 1 year. Each autumn, their leaves and stems die, but the roots remain alive throughout the winter. Are there any other plants in the pond? Annual plants. Plants that live for only 1 year cannot grow in the pond because they need sunlight to live. What would happen if we could keep the snow off the ice? Where the pond is bare, sunlight will shine through. This would allow tiny green plants called algae to grow just below the ice. Green plants like algae are important to the underwater world. First, they produce food for many animals. Second, they produce oxygen. Living things in the pond absorb oxygen dissolved in water. By midwinter, the ponds are usually covered with snow and the algae have disappeared. Some of the smaller dead plants float in the water and are eaten by pond animals. But most of the dead plant material settles to the bottom, where it decays. The decay of dead material is called decomposition. Decomposition is carried out by tiny organisms called decomposers. Decomposers live at the bottom of the pond, where the dead plant and animal matter has settled. They are called decomposers because they break down, or decompose, material that was once alive. Decomposers feed on dead plants and animals, turning their remains into a slippery ooze at the pond bottom. Most decomposers are so small that you need a microscope to see them. Paramecium is a common decomposer found in pond mud. Bacteria are a special kind of decomposer. They break down the ooze even more than other decomposers and enrich it with nutrients. Nutrients are food substances that plants and animals need for proper growth. In some ways, studying animal life in a pond during winter is easier than during other seasons. Many small water animals are attracted to the light and can be scooped up for closer study. This is a diving beetle. A diving beetle uses its hind legs like oars, rowing through the water, searching for insects and other small animals to eat. Water boatmen also feed on the dead plant and animal matter floating in the water. This peculiar-looking animal with all the legs is called a side swimmer. It is named for the way it moves through the water. Side swimmers don't like the light, so you may have to hunt for them among the material at the bottom. Two species of fish can be found in some of the ponds, even during winter. This one is called a stickleback. These tiny spines give the stickleback its name. Fathead minnows also live in some of the ponds. Like sticklebacks, they never grow much bigger than your finger. At one time, larger fish like rainbow trout were stocked in a Stoughton lake. One winter, they all disappeared. Sometimes, by the end of winter, there is so little oxygen left in the water that many animals die. This is called winter kill. What happens to all the oxygen? Why is there a shortage? Decomposers like bacteria use oxygen as they break down dead plants and animals at the pond bottom. Side swimmers use oxygen as they scuttle about in the pond. Diving beetles and fathead minnows and sticklebacks use oxygen too. In fact, almost every living thing in the pond uses it. Remember that green plants like algae produce oxygen, but the algae die early in the winter, as soon as there is enough snow to stop sunlight from shining through the ice. When all the oxygen is used up, winter kill occurs. This is what happened to the trout in Stoughton Lake. If an oxygen shortage does occur, small animals like stickleback that need less oxygen than larger animals like trout are more likely to survive. Despite the oxygen problem, the snow-covered pond makes it possible for many animals to survive that would otherwise die. First of all, it is much warmer in the water than it is outside the pond. The temperature in the pond is about 4 degrees Celsius. Animals living in the pond are protected from the cold by the water itself. Also, the warm temperature allows animals like frogs to hibernate in the pond mud without freezing. Secondly, the animals that live in the pond are cold-blooded. The phrase cold-blooded describes animals whose body temperatures are about the same as the water in which they live. This means that as the water becomes colder, the animal's body temperature drops. Cold-blooded animals become sluggish and less active. All the systems in their bodies begin to slow down. They don't breathe as often. Their blood circulates very slowly, and they don't grow as fast. Because they're not using as much energy as before, they don't eat as much food. This is a perfect answer to winter. Food is in short supply, and animals who can get by on less are more likely to survive. Dark, still, and quiet. This is the world below winter's ice in Elk Island National Park. Here, in the slippery ooze of the pond bottom, decomposers break down the dead plants and animals and make the mud rich with nutrients. Beetles and side swimmers move slowly through water whose temperature never falls below freezing. Fish no bigger than your finger search the dark waters for a winter meal. And here, in the thick mud at the pond's bottom, seeds and egg cases lie waiting for spring. Even in winter, these are living waters.